Hey everyone, how's it going? Again, this is Joshua McCarthy with the Young Adults Group. So excited to be back and kind of assisting with the lesson this week. To go over a few kind of housekeeping things. As a reminder, the 18 to 25-year-olds, we are doing these Sunday schools every Sunday evening. I know Josh has been doing stuff over the last couple of weeks, so it's now my turn. And so today I'm going to talk about patience. And I know we've talked about this a little bit in some of the other lessons that I've done in previous recordings. But this one is going to be an interesting perspective. This is from three different stories in the Bible and how God taught individuals patience and how he's blessed those individuals. And so we're going to talk a little bit about patience. In the upcoming weeks, we're looking into a new series. I'll have more details hopefully by next week. So either Josh and I will tag team it, or I'll go ahead and take the lead for the next few weeks. And then hopefully kind of when we get through this next series, we'll be ready to jump back into the lessons that we were doing on the continue series, and we'll be able to kind of jump back in once we eventually get back in person. But I think today's lesson will apply to us really, really well on patience. I think that we all have to have a little patience now with what's happening in the world. And sometimes it can be challenging because we're ready to do this. We want to go out. We want to hang out with friends. We want to go do this or that. And I think this is a time that God is teaching the world patience. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. So the first verses we're going to go over is Genesis 17. So it's in the book of Genesis. 17, 1 through 6, and verses 17. And this is just part of the story, and I'll hopefully be able to share a little bit kind of as we go. But this is the story of Abraham and Sarah. And so Abraham, prior to this, you'll notice the name's a little bit different at the beginning. His name was Abram. And then the same thing with his wife, Sarah. Her name used to be Sarai, Sarai. And so you'll see kind of throughout the story that they actually take a little bit of a turn in their names change, and God gives Abram the name Abraham. So let's go ahead and read the verses. I'll kind of go over a little bit overview and then how it's kind of applicable, I think, in our lives. So Genesis 17, 1 through 6 and 17 says, "And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abraham fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations." And through those verses, saying father of many nations, meaning that he's going to have a lot of children, a lot of descendants. But the problem you'll see throughout here is actually he doesn't have any children at this point in time. So he's 99 and doesn't have any children. And that's going to be the cool part as we kind of go through. So neither shall thy name anymore be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. Right? So that's what Abraham means. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And then in verse 17, then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? And I think those verses it's actually pretty cool hearing this story. It's one of those Sunday school stories that you learn about, is to give you a little perspective. So Abraham and Sarah were older, and God said that there's going to be many nations that are going to come from you, and you're going to have a child. And so as we kind of walk through, you'll find out that Sarah, actually, her name was Sarai, and then now it's Sarah. You'll kind of learn that they came up with, they tried to do something on their own. And as we'll go through, you'll see that in that decision to do it on their own, something comes out of it. So I think sometimes God asks us to wait for something, even though he's promised it to us, which I think is important. That's kind of the lesson we'll learn through here. But God promised Abraham he would be the father of many people, but he was at a very old age and, again, didn't have any children. So Abraham and Sarah knew what God told them. So they took matters kind of into their own hands. And Sarah actually had a handmaiden, and that handmaiden's name was Hagar. And Abraham and Sarah and Hagar Sarah kind of came up with the plan and presented it to Abraham and said, hey, why don't you try to have a child with Hagar? Since we can't have children, and God's saying like, hey, we're going to have all these children, and we're going to have many nations. And eventually that's what happened. So Abraham ended up being with Hagar and had a child. And that child was not what God had intended at that point in time, right? I think in that specific time, they took matters kind of into their own hands. So Abraham and Sarah then trusted God, and they waited patiently for him after that. This doesn't mean that they waited perfectly, right? So they did wait, and they knew that God's promises will remain true, but they didn't wait perfectly, meaning that they tried to take matters into their own hands. So I think this is an important lesson to understand that sometimes God asks us to wait. And even though we don't want to wait, he's promised something good that'll come out of the wait. And I think of everything that's happening now, right? And you'll find at the end of the story that Abraham and Sarah, they do end up having a child. They have some visitors come and say, hey, by the next time we visit, you're going to have a child. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. And you'll see throughout the stories that the child and actually both the children actually do end up populating the earth. And Abraham, really what God promised does come true. He does become the father of many nations. And so I think that's so important that sometimes God promises us things. Sometimes the authorities promise us things. And we just have to be patient. We just have to wait that it's in God's timing. And I think of everything that's happening now, right, with COVID. Think about we're having to wear masks. We're having to wait. We can't open up everything. We can't do this. We can't go see movies. We can't hang out in big crowds. We can't go up to camps. Like there's just so many things that we're limited in what we can do, but God always promises that his people are going to be okay. So God always takes care of his people in the end. And I think that's important to remember through the story, is that we might have some trials and we might have some struggles right now, but if we wait patiently, God will provide for us. And it refers, the verse that I think kind of relates to this specific story that I think is really helpful is Psalm 41. Psalm 41 says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. And you'll know that God did bless Abraham and Sarah at the end of the story, and God will bless us. There are lots of times when we ask God, and sometimes it's not a yes, it's not a no, it's not right now, right? Or maybe you need to wait before you're going to get an answer. And it's so important that if we wait patiently for the Lord, that he's going to provide for us. He does hear our cries. He does hear our pleas. He does hear our prayers. Another story I wanted to go over that I found really interesting when I was kind of looking through on the topic of patience is the story of Joseph. So this one, we're going to read through many verses. This is going to be in Genesis 37, Genesis 37, chapter 37, 36, 39, and 45. And I'm going to read a few verses from each of those just so you have an understanding of the story. And then I'll actually go over a little bit of the story as well. So, and it came to pass when Joseph has come unto his brethren that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him. So you'll learn that the coat of many colors that this is referring to was actually a sign from Joseph's dad that he was kind of the favorite child. So he was actually number 11 out of 12 children, and he was his father's favorite. So this is talking about, and it came to pass when Joseph was coming to his brethren, so his brothers, and they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit. So they threw him into a pit, into a hole, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And then you'll see later on, then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. So, and Reuben returned unto the pit. So at this point, they've thrown Joseph into the pit. So Midianites found him, sold him to the Ishmaelites, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. And then Reuben, which was his brother, returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes, right? So he grabbed his clothes, and he returned unto his brethren and said, the child is not, and whither shall I go? And they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of goats. So they killed a bunch of goats and dipped the coat in the blood, right? I think we're kind of understanding. So the brothers go back and find that Joseph's missing from the pit. So they have his clothes, grab his coat, and then they dip it in blood. They kill goats and they dip it in blood, and they're trying to show, as you'll see, that he was killed. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "This have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no." And he knew it and said, "It is my son's coat. An evil beast have devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces." And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. So Jacob was his dad. And that's so interesting, right? So they threw Joseph into this pit. Some merchants find him, grab him, sell him. He ends up ending up in Egypt. His brothers find out he's not in the pit. And so they decide, okay, well, let's dip his coat in goat's blood. And then let's go ahead and show that to our father, and he'll think he's dead. He think he was devoured by a beast, and that's exactly what happened. And his father, it said, mourned for his son many days. So, and then it says again, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt, and it actually ended up going under Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's, a captain of the guard. And that's in verse 36. And his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him. And he made him overseer over his house and all that he had put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And you'll see that his master Potiphar, that he saw that he was had God's favor, right? And that the Lord was with him. And so Joseph found grace through that and served his master and did it with a happy heart, right? As much as you can be when you're sold kind of into a situation like that. And then it says that he became a very kind of like Potiphar's kind of right-hand man. And you'll find throughout the story that he actually was overseer. There actually became a famine in the land. And so Joseph actually was overseeing all the food and divvying out the food for those families in Egypt because of the famine. So, and then you'll see, and later on as we go through the next few verses that I want to go over, and Joseph said unto his brethren, "Come near to me, I pray you," and they came near. So this is referring to, so after Joseph became overseer of the famine, you'll find throughout the story that his brothers actually are facing this famine, and they need food, they need help, they need assistance. So they go to Egypt, and they goes to the leaders, to Pharaoh, and they're like, "Hey, you need to go see this guy Joseph. He's overseeing the food and divvying it out." And as you can tell, Joseph happens to be their brother, right? So these brothers of Joseph happen to come and see Joseph because of the famine and was seeking out help. So I think it's ironic that they're struggling and they have this famine and they end up going back to Egypt, and then they find, oh man, our brother that we threw in the pit and we thought maybe was dead is actually overseeing and can actually determine whether we're going to get food and be able to continue to live. So, and that's where we're going in this next session. And Joseph said unto his brethren, "Come near to me, I pray you." And they came near. And he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Right? And I think the lesson through here is when we trust God in the midst of waiting, we allow him to work on our behalf. And that's exactly what happened, right? So Joseph was his father's favorite, and he went through a terrible ordeal, but he trusted the Lord through all of that. And look at what actually ended up happening to him, right? He actually got into a position of authority and trust with Egyptian leadership, that he had the ability to actually determine who gets the food. And in essence, think about it, that his brothers wronged him, but he could have done that same thing to his brothers when they came to him and said, "Hey, yo, we kind of need some food." He could have been like, "Yeah, you tried to sell me, you left me in a pit, not gonna happen." But you'll find through the story that's not what Joseph did. And Joseph, and through that story, God actually blessed. And I think it's a great picture of forgiveness as well. But we find through the story that those who trusted in God in the midst of waiting, we allow him to work on our behalf. And he allowed, through the waiting, Joseph had many times where he was waiting and just determining, like, hey, what's going on, when he was being sold into slavery, that God blessed him through it. And God had something better for him on the end and was able to work through it. So I think it's important we allow God to work through things and work it out through us. Joseph could have been scared and angry at his brothers and what they did to him, but he faithfully worked with a good attitude while he waited through his life in Egypt. He became friends with the king, and God used his new relationship to provide for his family. And I think that's a great story of grace and forgiveness, but also a great story of patience, that sometimes there are going to be difficult times in our life. God doesn't promise that our lives are going to be easy, but God does promise that he's going to bless us and he's going to take care of us in the end. And I think that that's a great picture of God and waiting upon his patience. And I think, again, about what we're going through with COVID and what we're all going through our lives, whether it's COVID related or something personally related, that sometimes when we fully trust in God, so when we fully trust in God, that God works through those challenging times and through those patience to provide good. And I think about my own life, and as you all know, I used to be the choir director. If you didn't, I used to be the choir director up until about a year ago, and did that for 5 years here at Maranatha. And the last year has been really a waiting period. I've been able to serve in music and been able to serve in many ministries, but I didn't know what God wanted. And I was patient, but not as patient as I would have liked to been. And I think through the last year, God has blessed me, and God has been able to allow me to serve in so many other ministries, including being a part of the 18 to 25-year-olds, and just being able to truly be able to serve him and devote my time in him during this waiting and patient period to see what God has next for me. And I think that's so important to remember when you're facing struggles in your life, that sometimes you got to pray and you need to be patient. So not complaining and just understanding that God's going to bless you and he's going to work through you during this patient times. And I think of the verse that I think related to this a lot was Galatians 6:9. And let us not be weary in well-doing. So not be weary, but remember that we're going to grow stronger with the Lord. For in due season, we shall reap if we faint not, right? If we don't give up, if we're fully trusting in God, that let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap. Like we said, God's going to take care of us. God's going to bless us through that patient times. And then the last story that I wanted to go over that I think is also a really great story is the story of Moses. And if you know anything about Moses, to give you kind of a little background behind it, Moses, the Israelites were captured in Egypt under Pharaoh. And at this point in the story, Moses had gone multiple times to Pharaoh and said, hey, like, let my people go. God's saying he wants his people to be free. He wants his people to be let go. And Pharaoh said, no, 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 no. And after the plagues, the 10 plagues, Pharaoh was like, okay, fine, go. Right. And so they ended up leaving, but Pharaoh was like, I changed my mind. I want you all to still be captive. We need to get them back. Chases after the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, where God opens the Red Sea and allows the Israelites to cross this giant sea. And as the Pharaoh and his army followed through, the sea collapsed and killed everybody who was in Pharaoh's army. And this is kind of the after that. So this is in Deuteronomy 29, 2-5 is what we're going to read. And Moses called unto all Israel and said unto them, ye have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, unto Pharaoh and unto all his servants and unto all his land, saying, you've seen all the blessings that I've done in your life, and how through those 10 plagues you were all patient and God provided deliverance through all that. The great temptations which thine eyes have seen, the signs and those great miracles, yet the Lord hath not given you an heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear unto this day. And I have led you 40 years in the wilderness, and your clothes are not waxen old upon you, and thy shoe is not waxen old upon thy foot. And I think this is important to know. This is actually Moses chatting with the Israelites, and he's saying, look, the Lord has provided us so much. And that last verse I find really interesting. And we have, and I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. So this is the 40 years that they're walking around in the wilderness and wondering, like, what's next? Like 40 years. Imagine 40 years, like in the wilderness. Like, I can't imagine, because I'm only 32. I'm not even 40 yet, but to think 40 years of walking around in the wilderness, kind of seeing where we need to go and what's next and what God has called. But God provided through them in so many situations. You can go back and look at all the times that God provided manna for them from heaven and quail, and also provided medical assistance in certain situations. And it's just, it's so incredible what God has like blessed through them, and they keep complaining. And when he says in this verse 5, and I have led you 40 years in the wilderness, your clothes are not waxen old upon you, which means they've been walking 40 years and had the same clothes, and they're not worn out. And thy shoe is not waxen old upon thy foot. And their shoes, imagine walking around for 40 years and wearing your Air Jordans or your Cons, and literally they're not, nothing has faded. It's still in like pristine condition. And for 40 years, like I can't imagine that. Shoes after a couple years for me and they're done. They're gonzo. But God provided through that. And I think we learn through this, because God is so patient with us, we should be patient with others, right? And the same thing happens to Moses. And you'll find in another story with Moses that he got really upset at the people of Israelites for complaining. And he actually, God had asked Moses, hey, I'll provide you water in this specific situation, but I need you to speak to the rocks and water will come out and come from heaven. Well, Moses smacked it with his rod. He hit the rocks instead of spoke to the rocks. And because of that, God had some serious consequences for Moses. But I think of that as him not being patient with God, but also not being patient with the Israelites and their complaining. And it's so important that it's a great example, and God punished Moses for that. But it's important for us to remember that we need to be patient, not only with what God has planned for us, but we need to be patient with others, right? And I think back to the leaders of what's happening with COVID right now, right? We all have opinions. We're all upset, or we're all happy, or some of us are like pro-mask, and some of us are like, I hate masks. Some of us are like, I want to go out and do whatever I want. Some people are like, no, everyone needs to stay home. But we need to be patient. And it says in the Bible that God puts leaders into our lives for a reason, puts authority figures, especially those in government. He references kings multiple times and putting them in place. But in our society, putting in those government leaders, and I think of governor here local as well as the president, God puts those people in our lives and puts those leaders in authority because he has a plan through it. And I think that's so important that we think about, oh, we don't like how they do this, I don't do that. But do we really sit back and understand that it doesn't matter what they do? We have opinions, and we can stand up when it crosses a line or crosses anything, but God has a plan through all of that, through those leaders and through the decisions that they make. And I think that's great in understanding the story. And I think it helps us understand the patience of God. His heart is tender, and he understands our struggle to wait and to endure. And especially nowadays, he's always available with exactly what we need to keep going. Likewise, he wants us to share this same patient character with others, right? Think of the patience that God provides in our lives. And I think of the ultimate patience that he had, where we've maybe struggled in our lives with making a decision for salvation, and then we turn to him. That could be years where God understands and is waiting for us to return to him, waiting for us to accept salvation. We should be giving that same type of patience towards others. And again, this is very challenging for me, and I'm so convicted, and I love talking about patience, because for me, it's one of my biggest struggles. So when I go through and I start reviewing these lessons on patience, or looking at anything on patience, I am almost always convicted 100% on every single one of these topics. And that's why I like talking about it, because it helps challenge me on where am I in regards to patience. And it says, just like God graciously understands our struggles and our needs in the midst of waiting, he wants us to work to understand that of others. And when we are patient with others, we are being an example of God's good character. And the verse that it's related is, but thou, O Lord, it's Psalm 86:15. But thou, O Lord, art a God full of compassion and gracious and long-suffering. Long-suffering means patience. It's one of the fruits of the Spirit, and plenteous in mercy and truth. And it reminds us that God is full of patience. So if we are to be Christ-like, if we're to be more like Christ, then we need to be patient. We need to exhibit that fruit, and we need to really work on teaching ourselves patience with others and being patient on God. And so those are the three stories. I think those are great stories, but it brings me back to my life verse, which is something that I have two life verses, Ephesians 4:32, and I have this other one, which is Isaiah 40:31. And it says, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint. And I want you to listen to those words one more time. I'm going to read it this time in a little bit slower. But they that wait upon the Lord, so those who are patiently waiting upon the Lord for God to provide signs, for God to direct us in our paths, shall renew their strength. Think about how we're feeling with all this COVID. And are we feeling like we have the strength and we're excited and we're passionate, we're ready to go out and tell people about God or go out and do things? I know I'm not, and that's something that I struggle with. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles, referring to we can rise above our struggles by being patient and by waiting upon God's timing instead of trying to do it on our own. And I think of like baby birds when they have birds, and when we're referring to they shall mount up with wings as eagles, I think of like baby eagles who are just like ready to go, and they flop out and they're probably going to fall, right? But that's not, God wants us to wait on him. And as we wait and grow and we become patient and relying on God, that he's going to give us wings, just like eagles will be able to mount up and overcome. And they shall run and not grow weary, which means endurance, right? For those trying times in our life when we face difficult situations, if we're fully trusting Christ, we're fully trusting and putting our faith in Christ, that he's going to provide for us and that he's going to bless us in the end, that we're going to be able to endure those struggles. We're able to run and not grow weary, walk and not faint, meaning that, and I think again of like a 5K or 10K, and you're running and you'll be able to endure the whole time. And it's just like you hear different passages, and I've heard different songs on Run the Race that's set before us. And it's the same thing in referencing this verse. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. If we're fully being patient, we're fully trusting in Jesus and waiting for his timing, he will give us the strength and endurance to endure all the trouble times, especially now with COVID. But that's just a little bit on my heart and what I wanted to share in regards to patience. It is a hot topic for me. It is one of 2 to 3 things that I really, really struggle with, and that I have to work on a daily basis to overcome and make sure that I'm fully trusting in God and giving the patience that he's going to provide in due time. So I want to just close us out in prayer, and then we'll kind of be all set for this evening. So, dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity to jump into your word and to learn a little bit more about you. I love these Bible stories. I love learning about these Sunday school lessons because these characters in the Bible give us a clear example of what patience looks like and how you've blessed it. And there are countless other stories. There are countless things that I can think throughout the Bible that all have to do with patience. I think of Job. I think of Peter. I think of Paul. I think of many other historians and individuals that were in the Bible. And these real life people that endured this patience and ran the race for you, Lord. It was patient and in your timing, and you blessed them through all of this. I pray for every single 18 to 25-year-old. I pray that they would learn something from this lesson, and that they would get that their lives, if they fully rely on you and that they're fully trusting and patient in your timing, that you're going to provide for them in your timing, and it's going to be perfect timing. It might not always be what we want, but you know it's what's best for us, Lord. I pray that you keep every single 18 to 25-year-old safe, especially under these current conditions, Lord. Please just keep them safe. Help us to learn more about you and grow throughout the week and tell someone about you. And ask in your name, amen. All right, so I'm actually in the Sunday school, actually in a Sunday school room, and so the lights are kind of in and out. And if I'm not like waving my hands or moving, apparently they continue to stay off. But again, reminder: just keep in touch with us. Let us know if there's anything that we can pray for you. Josh, Julie, and I would love to sit down, catch up, get a coffee, go out to dinner. Um, we really care about you. And I know that we've had a few conversations with a couple of you, but we'd love for you to reach out if you're going through anything, or even if you're not, we'd love to just go and take you out for a coffee or take you out to dinner, have you come over to our house, maybe play some Mario Kart or something. But just know that we're praying for you. We care for you. Please keep in touch with us, and we'll see you at church. Have a good one, y'all. Bye-bye.